Our season continues on the surface of a red planet. Fires erupted from the wreckage of 2 starcraft. Anakin rubbed his forehead, looking around and making sure he was clear, before using all of his physical strength to lift the weight of the cockpit off of himself. He placed his hand on the edge of the rim where the glass once was, and pulled back immediately. It was very hot. He must have been knocked out for a while. He pressed his burnt hand into his cloak, as he slowly got up and scanned the area around him. He didn't recognize the planet. He leapt from the ship and looked over, calling out R2's name. As he was doing this, his hand hovered gently over his lightsaber, and he searched for his little blue astromech. Luckily for him, the droid wasn't on the planet. Wherever R2 was, he was safer than Anakin. He then came to the moment and truly understood what had happened. They had started a battle with General Tin over Ord Cestus. Natabre, Zala, and Ahsoka all came to mind immediately. He was curious about them, hoping that they were all alright. But what happened? He didn't really have a feasible answer, because what could his answer be? They were likely still interlocked in combat, or maybe not. Who knows? Without R2, he was without vital information. Anakin moved back to the ship and climbed on top, so that he could see if there was any damage to R2's astromech slot. It was clear upon second viewing that his little blue companion had been jettisoned into space before the jump to hyperspace started. Hopefully, that was the case. He was worried that the droid may have gotten stuck somewhere between the hyperspace route they used to get here, wherever here was. Skywalker looked over to his opponent's ship. All of his own senses were coming back to him at the moment. He was able to feel the immediate danger present on this planet. What or who it was, he was unsure. He looked at the ground and tried to think of a name for the system. It had to be Satos. In his mind, that seemed like the right answer. But he always did have a hard time with his social studies and geography classes. Regardless, he moved from the crashed yellow starfighter to the ancient weapon of the Sith Lord. One apparently without the caution of slowing down when one's opponent flips their engines off to counter. Anakin tried to see within the cockpit, but he couldn't see anything. There was no proof that his opponent was even alive. Chances are, he was, but inside the ship, there was nothing. He used the Force to shatter the window of the cockpit, but it continued to reveal that Revan had vanished. Skywalker got off the ship and stepped forward into the forest, avoiding the raging fires of the wreckage. Hopefully the locals would have a means of transportation off this planet. Anakin walked through the grounds of the forest, trying to track for any signs of Revan's presence. Anakin felt like he was being hunted, but something told him that it wasn't just the Sith Lord he arrived with. Anakin ran to a tree and slid in the dirt as he stopped next to it. His human hand slid down the bark of the tree. Part of him was hoping that he would catch a sense of Revan from doing this. The other part was hoping to connect with the planet and understand why it felt so dark. His eyes drifted around. The sun seemed like it was blocked out. Everything on this planet was red. Skywalker kept trying to piece everything together, running through survival instincts and geographical locations in the galaxy. What was close to Ord Cestus? He didn't know. It just felt like here is where he was meant to be. Is it possible that this planet housed someone familiar to him? Skywalker didn't know. He peered around the corner of the tree, looking for the sign of life. He could see bouncing silhouettes, but they weren't people. They were simply weeds sprouting up from the ground. Anakin sighed and took a deep breath, feeling his body slow down and trying to cement himself in his own inner peace. Anakin felt a sense of comfort rise, and he turned to run around the corner. Just as he moved, a red lightsaber slid past his eyes. He fell backwards and grabbed his own saber. Anakin looked up at the broken mask of Revan, one with a slit sliding down the right of his face. There was fury in his eyes, as Skywalker ripped his own lightsaber into action and jabbed forward, using all of his momentum from the ground to lift himself, and hopefully his opponent. Revan blocked the blade down, forcing Anakin to stumble before ever getting to his feet. He turned fully to the side and threw his hands up in front of him, as Revan sprang and jumped down, slamming his blades on Anakin's. While holding onto the edge of a lightsaber like a broadsword wouldn't help Anakin, he did use a force to cushion his defense, holding the weapon as firmly as he could with both hands, one hovering below the lightsaber itself. He slid back, throwing a counter, but Revan was just too quick, sliding his weapon across his body and backhanding Anakin's weapon, before igniting another crimson blade. Anakin ducked away, sliding against a tree as Revan swung aggressively, cutting the tree into pieces and driving the other blade at the young Jedi Knight. Anakin recovered quickly, deflecting the first strike, sliding under the other, before driving his saber at Revan. The Sith countered, twisting his wrist awkwardly and blocking the strike precisely. They backed away from each other and slowly moved in a circle, like prey preparing to strike their hunt, except both of them were hunting the other. Anakin knew that in some form he was outclassed by the superior warrior, but he couldn't allow that thought to bog down his optimism. This fight, like any other, could be won. Revan could see the hesitation, all of his personal time preparing for Skywalker's demise, but this moment, right here, was where Revan could swing things back into his own control. All of their headhunting, and now they were stranded on this planet alone. This could be his chance to ensure his own Sith Empire rose from the ashes. Revan swung one of his lightsabers around and held it in a reverse grip before extinguishing the other and holding out his hand. He told Anakin that he could join him. Skywalker's brows stiffened as he backed away from this vile combatant. He told Revan that they were not going to be friends. They never would be. Revan's eyes were filled with anger, only one of which Anakin could see. Revan told Anakin fiercely, his voice breaking on impact with the air, that he could have everything. This war didn't need to be fought. It could be won by him alone. His power was feared by the Sith. His potential was so immense that they wanted his head. Anakin grinned, telling Revan that if it meant he feared him more than anyone else, why would he be trying to make a deal right now if he wasn't afraid of losing? Revan took a deep breath, and his face contorted under the mask. He told Skywalker that this was his final chance for redemption, one final shot at ruling the galaxy by his side. Anakin raised his lightsaber to his chest and told Revan that there would be no negotiating. He would die today. Revan readied himself as Anakin prepared his own strike and swung in. Over Ord Kestis, CC-10 was spinning his starship around the bridge of the Sith destroyers. Malak had realized that they were finished here. Their chance for victory had been taken away from them. Sure, they could win without Revan, but in his own mind it'd be better to survive this battle with more forces than not. And with the Sith Lord gone, it was Malak's turn to try and seize the throne. Saesee was trailed by a number of Sith interceptors, and behind him flew in Natabre. Her blasters ripped through the Sith starships. Saesee was making this easier for her. She didn't have to worry about hitting the back of the ship, which gave her the opportunity to shred each of the fighters. Natabre sped away, reuniting with the Padawans, who were targeting a corvette that attempted to hit Republic bombers. Ahsoka and Zala dropped their torpedoes as the corvette's engines were busted open. The three Jedi spun around the flaming vessel, as Admiral Coburn gave the order to forward the three Star Destroyers. Their heavy cannons shredded the hulls of the Sith fleet. Now that they were no longer fighting a smaller force, Malak saw no realistic way to win this combat. He turned to the deckhand and ordered a full-blown retreat. The Sith tried to make their turnaround, but they were struggling with that. The older tech, despite holding its own in combat, needed a much wider turning radius, which allowed Coburn's destroyers to shred the hulls of their vessels. Malak ordered the fighters to hold off any Republic bombers, but with 4 Jedi in the field of fighter combat, it was nearly impossible for them to win their dogfights. Natabre led the charge with Saesee and the Padawans following tightly behind. They ripped through the few stragglers that were able to get past the Republic V-19s. The Jedi pilots slipped by and buzzed the bridge of the supporting destroyer. Just as they did, the vessel detonated from behind. Republic Star Destroyers were bearing down on the Sith fleet. Their fight was lost. Their forces hit their hyperspace levers and jumped away from the system. The Republic fighters gave the Sith survivors of the fight a chance to surrender, but every single one of them tried to slog their way out of it. None of them would survive. When the 4 Jedi got back to Admiral Coburn's flagship, being that they were now working in a temporary joint operation, they had no clue where Skywalker and the Sith he was connected with could have gone. Natabre's astromech had since informed her that one of the vessels had dropped in cabin pressure. One of those pilots was losing air inside their vessel. She, nor the droid, knew which one it was. This added a lot of extra stress to their case. They needed to figure out where they could have gone. Luckily for them, One of the captains inside the fleet was super obsessive about making a note of every little detail inside the fleet, combat, and any other operation, and he happened to notice the hyperdrives powering up. The captain told the rest of the Jedi and Republic forces that based on their trajectory, they could have had a short jump to Bodajef, Gwenene, Halmad, Wayland, Dathomir, or Terrace. However, due to their trajectory being towards the core, they could have gone as far as Hapes, Hawk, Chandrelia, or even Hosnian Prime. There was simply no way of telling how far they could have gone specifically. The captain was apologetic for not logging it sooner, because while he did note it, he wasn't able to get a full readout of the range of which the hyperspace would activate. Stacey told the Jedi to go. He and his fleet had survived the battle. They needed to maintain territory outside of Mandalore, and despite Anakin's trajectory being southwest, Mandalore was southeast. Natabre told Admiral Coburn to prepare the scouts, and her own personal hyperspace ring. He asked her which of the planets they were going to, and she pointed out a number of which the captain had noted. Ahsoka and Zala said that they would join her, and she declined. They were also instructed and ordered to stay put. They would find General Skywalker, but they could not afford to lose them too. The main fleet would drop into Sith territory, while support ships, like corvettes or light cruisers, would move to scout out planets that the Jedi and Sith could have been sent to. Inside the Red Forest, Anakin was back against another tree. They were trading blows, but Anakin was clearly outclassed here. He was struggling against the likes of the Sith Lord. There was still so much to learn, and he was fading fast. Skywalker dodged a strike before throwing his elbow into Revan's sternum and shoving it backwards. Anakin saw his opportunity and swung his lightsaber for Revan's head, but he ducked, tilting his head to his shoulder and using the awkward momentum to bring his leg up and kick Anakin square in the jaw. He stammered and turned around. Revan was back on his feet. This fight was impossible. Two duelists slugging away at each other. Revan knew he could win, but the kid was resilient. He shuffled his lightsabers around and swung forward. Anakin blocked the strike and planted his foot into the ground and jumped back. No matter the raw physical strength, it was still impossible. Anakin spun away and Revan did too. They looked to each other and pointed their weapons at one another. One would come out on top of this. One had to. As they prepared to make their strikes again, the winded duelists could hear shuffling around them. A tribe of barbaric Zabraks pounced from the forested areas surrounding them, and the two opponents turned almost around robotically. They had a common foe now, and it wasn't each other. Anakin and Revan had a moment of realization following this action, but they both decided to remain focused on the Zabraks. The leader of the tribe didn't speak common, and he told them to surrender, and their deaths wouldn't be as painful. Or they could fight, and their deaths would be miserable. Anakin and Revan had no clue what the barbarian was saying, but to Revan, it totally cleared up the fact that they were on Dathomir. For Skywalker, he came to that conclusion a few short moments after Revan did. They readied their sabers, and Revan told Anakin that this temporary truce would last until they scared off these warriors. Anakin nodded, telling him that they'd win this together, then they would take a 15-minute break. Despite trying to be brooding and all Sith-like, Revan could appreciate the humor in that statement. They rushed in. The Zabraks may have not had lightsabers, but they were all warriors, and they threw their weapons at the Force users. Some of these were spears, pikes, axes, or sickles. Anything they really had to try and get their kills. Anakin extinguished his lightsaber and avoided these attackers by using his hands and legs to disarm them and knock them out. Revan saw this and thought it was pathetic. The Jedi all had so much power, but always resorted to the hardest way to accomplish things. Revan cut through some of the Dathomir weapons and then went for kills. But this also meant that more of the fighting force surrounded him, because he proved to be more deadly. Whereas Anakin was fending off a multitude of Zabraks at the same time, just not as many. Anakin beat his opponents back, weaving between fighters and using all their own energy against them. As they were dueling, Anakin could hear shuffling from the trees above them, but he didn't have time to observe what it was. He simply was defending himself in a massive fist fight. He also used his metallic hand as an advantage. Nothing felt better than getting clobbered by pure metal. Behind him, Revan slung his lightsaber into a Zabrak's chest, before another one knocked the weapon from his hands, and right as he was about to counter with his remaining saber, he was put into a headlock. Anakin saw this from the corner of his eye as he kicked a Zabrak into another and took one by the shoulders, using all of his momentum and throwing him at Revan. It knocked the Zabrak holding Revan off of him, and allowed the Sith to shoot electricity out of his hands. The Zabraks dropped to the ground, and right as Revan was about to grab his lightsaber, all the barbaric people ran into the forest. Revan looked at Skywalker and thanked him, telling the young Jedi that he'd take him up on his 15-minute break. Anakin smiled before he was electrocuted. Revan looked up, and he too was shocked until he fell to his knees unconscious. The last thing he saw were red cloaks stepping over an already unconscious Anakin Skywalker. The Republic forces weren't having any luck with their discoveries. They'd hit numerous systems within the area, with support ships going as deep into the rim of the core as Null and Mirkur. Natabre had hit Bodojef and was sliding down towards Gweneni, as the main Republic fleet stopped down at Helmad. They were feeling hopeless, fearful that Skywalker had been consumed by space, as his ship's cockpit could have been the one that broke during his trip to wherever. Because Natabre was alone in this, she was starting to eat herself alive inside of her head. She was so focused on trying to find Anakin that she was starting to think about the unthinkable. Unlike the students who, hopefully, were with Coburn and Cody, she was fending off the demons inside of her head. Natabre simply couldn't afford to allow this train of thought to consume her. She forced these negative thoughts from her mind, telling herself that she simply hadn't found the right planet yet. As she detached from her hyperspace ring, she ignited the scanner and sped her ship down through the atmosphere of Gweneni. Her eyes closed and she felt through the Force, the promise of finding Anakin at the edge of her senses. The astromech inside of her vessel watched her without making a noise. He was plugged into the ship's scanner and he wasn't seeing any signs of recent activity from any vessels entering the system or any one of the planets within it. But they did a quick flyover, just to be sure the scanners weren't being derailed by some energetic illusion. Sometimes you just have to be sure, and for Natabre, she had to be sure. Handling Ahsoka and Zala would be incredibly difficult to do on her own, and even more than taking care of the students, there was the concern she had for herself. Worrying about losing the one true connection she had formed since her master's death was indescribable. Natabre focused and slowed down her heart. The anxiety of all of this had her chest thumping like the reactor of a Venator. She had to breathe, and that's what she did. Her eyes closed and she could feel life. At the moment, it was all life inside the cockpit. Her hands were firm around the control yokes. Her blood was moving through her veins. The astromech circuits were buzzing with life. Everything would be okay. She would find her friend, and everything would be okay. On Dathomir, Anakin and Revan woke up. They looked to the sides and they could see red boots surrounding them. Each of them had blurry vision, and they could hear a booming, echoing voice. Anakin snapped back immediately, believing that this was another nightmare with the ghastly individual he had seen numerous times. Revan reached for his lightsaber, but it was gone. The voice of the Great Mother herself stretched into their ears like a hypnotic hum. Their eyes looked up and they both met Talzin at the same time. She stood pridefully, mother of her clan, the great Night Sisters of Dathomir. Anakin no longer believed they were on Satos. This was real. They were real. Revan gritted his teeth, telling her that their race should have been extinguished upon their return. Talzin tilted her head towards Revan and raised her fingers delicately, as green mist washed out of her sleeve and embraced his skin. Revan started to reel as she told him to silence his mind. He wasn't who he thought he was, and his vitriol would not be tolerated here. Revan started to squirm as he felt his lips press shut without his will to stop it. The crawling under his skin was chilling to the bone, as it felt like Talzin was sewing his mouth shut with her witchcraft. The sizzling was unbearable as he tried to pull away. The mother looked to him and smiled, raising her finger to her lips and telling him to quiet himself. They would talk later. Anakin looked to Revan, whose eyes were nothing but panic. He turned back towards her and told her that he didn't come here to disrupt their way of life. The Republic didn't want to harm her. It was an accident. Talzin almost rolled her eyes as she stepped around the two warriors. She told him that she knew that. The Force was her guide. If they came here with malevolent intent, he would not have woken up. He asked her, then, why was he or they still alive? She expressed that there was something she wanted to understand. Anakin asked what, and she wanted to know about him. She could sense a great potential to the Force. Both of them had it to varying degrees. Talzin expressed that within their culture, they called it epilegmeno. The Jedi called it Chosen One, and the Sith had the term Sithari. She folded her hands together and said to each of them that throughout every generation, there were individuals meant to maintain balance in the Force. There were avatars of the Force, such as herself and Master Yoda. But Yoda in her mind was not just an avatar, he was a chosen one. However, She gestured to Skywalker. He wasn't just a chosen one, like the man beside him. He was something more, and she wanted to know. Anakin slipped out a few words, referring to himself as born of the Force itself. The Jedi called him that, but they didn't have much time to discuss that concept since the return of the Sith. She nodded her head. Her hand twisted ever so slightly, and two of the witches behind her turned around and walked away, though the two individuals did not notice this. She then switched her attention to Revan, telling him that he was like the boy, one that was meant to maintain balance but not to a greater degree. But that wasn't his path at the moment. He had been selected by a Sith Emperor to do his bidding. His work as a Jedi was not complete, and it was taken from him. She rolled her shoulders and told him to step forth, and told Skywalker that he was free to go. Anakin asked why, and she expressed that the Republic would maintain the status quo. She wasn't concerned with him. All she had was curiosity for her own well-being. Now that she had her questions answered, she wished him a fair journey ahead. Anakin nodded and got off his backside. One of the sisters handed him a lightsaber, and he thanked her. Before he left, he asked her where she was taking the Sith. Talzin stopped and told him that when they arrived, they came as adversaries. When they next met, they wouldn't be. She could guarantee that. He didn't ask a question, but his face showed it. She simply turned around, knowing a future Anakin would come to see. Anakin backed away as Revan was brought into the mouth of the cave, and disappeared into the shadows. Skywalker continued walking away until he got to the vessels that slammed down. Had he not been fearful of being hunted, he would have done this earlier, but now he was hoping for a chance to get into communication with the fleet. Hopefully they were still at Ord Cestus. The ships were heavily damaged, so it would take some ingenuity on his part. As he started to get to work, his mind pulsated. He felt his head and shook it off. Anakin's vision started to get cloudy, and he turned around. The forest was alive, but it felt like it was watching him. There was something or someone in there. This wasn't the Night Sisters or the Night Brothers. There was something evil lurking in that forest. What it was, he couldn't tell, but the constant chills rolling down his spine told him that he needed to work quickly. Inside the Dathomir cave, Revan struggled. He was trying to break away. He was getting angrier and angrier. He wanted to try and break out of whatever kind of grip Talzin had on him, but he couldn't. A couple of the sisters who were holding his limp body tossed him onto an altar of sorts. Talzin held a small dagger, and he started to squirm, demanding to know what she was going to do to him. She looked down with annoyance as she told him to stop being so childish. This would only hurt for a moment. Assuming that he was about to die, he tried pushing away, until he felt just a tiny little prick on his finger. Talzin turned it around and squeezed gently, as she tossed a bit of powder into a mixing bowl. It poofed out with orange smoke as she started to speak into it. Revan asked her what she was doing, or why she was doing this. Talzin's ritualistic tone stopped, as she took a thick wooden spike and drove it into the bowl. Her eyes were poisonous green, and she looked down at him. Talzin expressed that in a galaxy controlled by the Sith, there were victors and survivors. In a galaxy built on trust, there were equals. She was not going to threaten her clan or her planet with survival. In trust, she wouldn't have to worry about surviving a genocide. He, without missing a beat, demanded to know what she wanted with him. She looked down and laughed. It was sad. He didn't know. So much of his fight had been for nothing, because it wasn't his fight. Revan, she called him by name. It was time for him to be reborn the way he was originally created. He tried to pull away, not understanding as she explained to him that a Sith Emperor had cursed him. His free will was an illusion. His existence was in the eye of the one who had cursed him, and in her power she would free him, so that trust could be shared between equals. Talzin lifted her hands and green mist rose from her robes and encircled the bowl as she thrusted her hand forward gently, waving her elongated nails towards Revan's face. He reeled, his body convulsing, as he wailed in fury, pain, and release. As the green mist entered his face, red and gray mist started to exit. The echoes of a Sith Talzin had never met abandoned Revan's body. He cried out in excruciating pain, his echoes bouncing off the walls of the cave before silence rose over the Dathomir chamber. Revan's eyes opened, and they were pure. The green mist of the witches slipped out of his face, and what followed was white smoke. Talzin handed the bowl to his sister and folded her hands. In doing so, the restraints on Revan's body released, and he looked at her. She told him that he was free. He didn't know where he was or what had happened. Talzin promised an explanation, but his journey lay before him. A new path, a new chance to find his place in the ever-changing galaxy. As she said before, equality based on trust. Her only concern in this universe, or any universe, was the survival of her sisters and their clan. At the wreckage, Anakin continued to mess around with the controls. He was really struggling to find an answer. The materials had all cooled down from the burning fire that they were in the wreckage, and he was using his repair kit that was stored under his seat. But he was struggling to get the pieces to click. Luckily, the communication array on his own vessel wasn't completely destroyed, and sadly, all the technology from Revan's ship wasn't compatible with all the stuff he could work with. There were a couple of wires present that could be retrofitted, but he really didn't want to do that, mostly because it would take forever and the sun was starting to set on Dathomir. Anakin took a momentary break, setting up all the supplies he had and the dish he was working with. He knew there was a way to get this to function. It just was a matter of time. He set everything on the ground and dropped his hands to his hips as he started to pace around the wreckage. His eyes kept peering back over his shoulder. There was this sensation, one so uncomfortable and disgusting. It felt like he was being hunted, and he didn't care for it. When he wasn't looking over his shoulder, he was speaking to himself in a mumble. Well, if he could get the rotator to the back of the energy provider, no, wouldn't do that. The cords were broken or burnt. Anakin was getting frustrated. He knew there was a way to do this, but where was it? He got down on his knee and shuffled through the wires and pieces he had. Nothing here looked like it would work. He was so puzzled. Anakin flipped the device over, trying to see if he could get a better look. He had done this over and again, flipping it over, hoping that a light bulb would snap in his brain and help him put this entire thing back together. Skywalker found a piece, and just as he was about to get the wires and plug them in, he heard a twig snap. He jolted to his feet, his legs electrified, and his hand grabbed his lightsaber without even a hint of hesitation, but he didn't ignite it. His eyes scanned the darkness. The Dathomir forest already looked like a haunted location, twigs and branches falling frequently. There weren't any leaves on any of the trees, and yet the forest, wind, made it look like demonized trees waving at him. Maybe that's why he couldn't concentrate this entire time? That and the fact that there was something off with Dathomir itself. It wasn't the Night Sisters or the Night Brothers. Both were gone due to his interactions with them. He knew it wasn't them. He could feel it. There is someone out there. Anakin rolled his shoulder and told them to come out and face him. Skywalker then thought maybe what Talzin said was true. Maybe Revan would become the ally he was looking for. He called out Revan's name but heard nothing. The weird thing is, the forest was alive. There were animals bickering to each other. Even as night started to crawl over the skies of the planet, there was still life. Anakin made a puzzled face as he turned to his sides, checking his flanks. He wished Natabre was here. His eyes focused back on the wreckage while he gripped his lightsaber. He couldn't have anything nice, as it turns out. Though, speaking of Natabre, he hadn't had much of a moment to think about her. She was probably worried sick. She likely split the fleet up. If only they knew how close to Orchestus he went. In his mind, getting home was all that mattered, so he turned his focus into the project he was working on. He picked up right where he left off, put everything together as quickly as he could. As he threaded the wires through the device, he smiled. Wait. Anakin felt a chill roll down his spine. Someone else was here. And then when he made the connection, the forest went still. The animals chirping, silence from their conversations, and the howling of delicate wind passing through every branch now dead. Anakin's blue lightsaber ignited, and the haze covered his body. His eyes scanned the entire forest until he saw a silhouette. He called out Revan's name, demanding that he stand down. But when a crimson lightsaber ignited, one that was double-bladed, he couldn't help but note that this wasn't Revan. Anakin raised his own weapon to his chest, demanding that the individual reveal his identity. The cloaked individual wore a hood over his head, so nothing was identifiable to Anakin. All he could see was the double-bladed saber, and the dark shadow of the cloak that hovered behind it. Without a word being spoken, Anakin readied himself as the creature approached him. They were at a distance, which allowed this hooded acolyte to gain speed. Anakin knew that to counter this, he needed to charge in as well. By the time he started, his opponent was up to full speed and lunged into the air, his hood floating off in the wind, and Anakin's eyes opened in complete shock as he dove for the ground. Naturally, he wouldn't have done that, but he couldn't believe who it was. As he rolled across the dirt of the Dathomir ground, he looked back and saw golden teeth, as Darth Maul slammed his boot down on all of Anakin's hard work. Skywalker demanded to know how he had survived. Maul's vile voice cut through the air like a dagger, telling his opponent that his survival was not of his concern. He was only here for Skywalker. Anakin knew that it meant Maul had returned with the Sith Empire. That had to have been the case. He raised his saber and told his opponent that he was here to finish what Kenobi started. Maul laughed, telling Skywalker that his former teacher didn't start anything. Instead, it would be he who finished off Kenobi's Jedi lineage with the death of Anakin. Skywalker rolled his eyes. How many Sith wanted him dead? There were too many to count by this point, but he raised his saber. Maul grinned, stepping in a circle to match Anakin's movement. Their weapons were ready. All it took was the first individual to make their strike. Skywalker took a deep and heavy breath. He could do this. He rolled his saber into his hands and swung forward aggressively. Their blades connected. Maul had obviously been planning for this moment, but so had Skywalker. Their blades danced in the darkness, red and blue illuminating the exterior of the dead forest. Anakin avoided strikes made by Maul, but he much preferred his odds here. He jabbed at Maul, who parried, spinning his sabers in a ferocious circle before driving them towards the Jedi. Anakin slipped back, knocking one end of the staff into the ground, before countering aggressively. Skywalker could see his moment here. He charged in. Maul backed up perfectly, countering by knocking forward left, right, left, right. The Jedi Knight leapt backwards to avoid what would have been a critical strike. This wasn't the same Maul he had trained against. Someone was teaching him how to master the blade, because everything Anakin had spent his adolescence inside the temple training against had changed drastically. He watched Maul's movements and readied himself. Maul kicked the ground and spun away, giving Anakin the slip, as Skywalker jabbed at the ground, but he had to slip back as he took a deep cut within his flesh, before Maul doubled back. He smiled at Anakin, who harnessed his anger for a short moment, steadying himself and rushing in. Maul prepared his parries, but Skywalker came with such force that his double-bladed saber was broken in half. Maul was able to hold on to one of the blades, as he reverse-gripped the saber and defended himself from losing his legs once again. Anakin slid across the ground and turned around, raising his saber. Maul smiled. As he prepared to strike again, a bright light blinded him as a green lightsaber ignited. He turned his head over and tried to defend himself as the blade hit the ground and sent the shockwave outwards. Maul was lifted off of his feet and tumbled across the forest floor. He looked over and rose from the ground, pulling his other saber into his hand with the force. He could see one Jedi starfighter and 2 Jedi. How interesting. He smiled and told Skywalker that the next time they met, he wouldn't be so lucky to be saved. His sabers extinguished, and he stepped backwards, vanishing into the darkness of the forest. Anakin looked over to Natabre with a joyous expression, saying that she found her, and she nodded her head with a soft smile, but her eyes were focused on the forest. The trees and animals all came back to life with a quiet hum. He told her that they were safe now. She asked how he knew, and he told her that the forest became quiet when he returned. Natabre extinguished her saber just as Anakin did. She asked him if that was who she thought it was. He nodded. It was Darth Maul. How or why, he didn't know, but somehow Maul had returned. She frowned. That wasn't good. She pointed at the crash site, asking if it was Maul who came from that. And Anakin shook his head. Revan must have thought he died, because it was a firestorm. However, it seemed as if Maul had come here from somewhere else. It didn't seem like he was corresponding with the rest of the Sith Empire. She nodded. Alright. Calling out to her astromech and telling him to contact the fleet and bring them some support. The two of them would keep their eyes pinned on the forest until their reinforcements arrived. Because Talzin had promised a future alliance, Anakin left behind a Republic starfighter. Its weapon systems were disabled, but it did have a hyperdrive. It was going to get scrapped anyways, so if Revan was going to indeed become an ally, then there was his ship. Inside the flagship, over the planet, Anakin would receive medical treatment for a wound that wouldn't heal. For whatever reason, it wouldn't stop being open. The odd thing is, despite the cut through his flesh being vile, it didn't bleed. It just hung open, which forced Anakin to continuously have to wrap it and change it to avoid an infection. Medics couldn't figure out what it was, and Anakin started to become concerned with what this meant for him. On Dathomir, Darth Maul walked to the forest, a chain of silence following his movement, until he reached a cave. He spoke to himself in a murmur, before slipping past some disjointed rocks. There was a deep blue light emanating from the chambers themselves. Maul got on one knee and told the individual by the altar that it was finished. The individual laughed quietly, before such a laugh became a thunderous echo. And that, my friends, is episode 7 of the Sith Clone Wars. Hope you are enjoying this season so far. Lifting the curse is pretty cool, but next week is also pretty cool. Stay tuned for more Sith Clone Wars. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.